Welcome to the first in a series of videos about the history of Japanese prints and the collection of Japanese works on paper at the Honolulu Museum of Art. I'm Stephen Salel, the curator of Japanese art. Before the coinage of terms such as ukiyo-e, and before the emergence of the famous print designers that we will focus upon in this series of videos, woodblock printmaking in Japan was mainly utilized as a way of reproducing text. For example, in 764, the Empress Koken ordered for a Buddhist chant known as Adarani to be printed 1 million times. Each print was then inserted into a 12-inch tall, 3-tiered wooden pagoda, and these pagodas were distributed to Buddhist temples throughout the archipelago. This publication project, known as the Million Dharani Towers, spanned 6 years and utilized a printing technique imported by Buddhist monks from China. The process was extremely expensive, and so until the 17th century, books were more commonly copied by hand than printed. Those texts that were printed were largely funded by Buddhist organizations which could afford to do so, and so the contents of such prints, like the Million Dharani Towers project, were mainly limited to sutra chants and other religious texts. Why was the printing of a text so expensive? The most straightforward way of printing a Japanese book at that time was a technique called seihanbon, in which a pair of pages was carved out of a single block of wood, and of course it was carved backwards because the final printed product was the mirror image of the woodblock itself. Around 1600, one of the first examples of movable Japanese type was created by the publisher Suminokura Soan, who lived in Saga Village near Kyoto. He therefore called his style of bookmaking sagabon, literally books from saga. They are considered by some to be the most beautiful examples of printed type in the history of Japanese bookmaking. The content of this particular book is a libretto for a no performance. In this way, we see that as printing became more affordable, the kinds of literature that were reproduced expanded far beyond the scope of Buddhist texts. The downside to sagabon was that they were limited to the 50 Japanese phonemes, known as kana, and only a small handful of kanji ideographs. The Japanese language includes 2,000 fundamental kanji, as well as over 48,000 more esoteric characters. Carving 50,000 characters as individual blocks for movable type, as well as keeping those blocks organized, would have been nearly impossible. So it makes sense that most publishers ultimately decided to use the seihanbon technique despite the intense labor that it required. The popularity of woodblock printing in the 17th century was the result of 3 important shifts in Japanese society. Firstly, the establishment of a peacetime economy. By the beginning of the 17th century, the military government based in the city of Edo, modern-day Tokyo, established a series of draconian measures to prevent the eruption of a civil war. Simultaneously, they closed all but a few ports in the country, and this policy of isolationism largely prevented international conflicts as well. Thanks to the social stability of the next 250 years, publishers invested their time and resources in the seihanbon technique, and for the same reason, commoners enjoyed the pastime of pleasure reading. Secondly, the emergence of a wealthy middle class and the rise of consumerism. With the designation of Edo as the center of the military government, the number of soldiers living in the city skyrocketed. Catering to the entertainment needs of those samurai, merchants and craftsmen, who up until then had been considered the two least important sections of society, suddenly had disposable income. For their own entertainment, they purchased woodblock printed books and single-sheet prints. Lastly, the rise of literacy. In the early 17th century, Buddhist temples throughout the country began to establish educational facilities in which students were taught to read. By the end of the 18th century, 70% of residents in Edo were attending such schools. The publication of textbooks, as well as easy-to-read leisure books, quickly became a very profitable business. As you've seen so far, the earliest books were filled purely with text, but with the introduction of this new generation of readers, the students of temple schools, publishers began to include illustrations to make their books easier to understand. The earliest illustrations, such as in this book, were quite small. But over time, the images grew to occupy a higher percentage of the page, until finally the literary genre of picture books, ehon, was born. As publishers realized the public's interest in images that were relatively free of text, they began to publish single-sheet prints in a variety of standardized sizes. The most common three sizes for single-sheet prints are oban, 10 inches by 15 inches, chuban, 7 inches by 10 inches, or about half the size of an oban, and koban, 5 inches by 9 inches, or about the size of a postcard. In addition, there were a few narrow, vertically oriented formats such as hashira-e, 29 inches by 5 inches, the name literally meaning pillar picture. As artists became increasingly ambitious, they frequently produced large-scale designs that spanned 2 sheets, a diptych, 3 sheets, a triptych, or sometimes even more. Since artwork seen in digital format loses its sense of size, it's a good idea to keep these standardized formats in mind. In the next video, we'll focus on Hishikawa Moronobu, the first documented woodblock print designer, as well as the term ukiyo-e that he and his publisher coined in the mid-17th century.